and really first women's rights convention was organized, and we're talking about this, was organized by Katie Stanton, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucreta Mott. And it was held in Seneca Falls, New York, and attended by approximately 300 women and men on July 19th and 20th, 1848. And it was held in Seneca Falls, New York, which is near the Finger Lakes, for those of you who know anything about New York. And actually this has some significance for me, because that's the site where Hobart and William Smith College is located. And that's where my daughter went to college. So she used to tell me about women's rights all the time. And this was a very significant event because it produced the most famous document in the history of feminism. The document was called the Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration of Sentiments. And the Declaration of Sentiments, if you haven't read it, you should, is very interesting for its sarcasm and its irony. Because what they decided to do, Stanton and Mott and others, was to parallel the Declaration of Independence and in many ways mock it. The Declaration of Independence, one of the most important documents in our political history. And let me read you a little bit of the Declaration of Independence. And it starts out, written again by our founding fathers, Adams, Jefferson, Madison. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for the people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So this is, in this first paragraph, what our founding fathers are saying. If one people wants to disengage itself from another people, they have an obligation to explain why. So in the context of that event, obviously we're talking about where the citizens of our colonies, citizens of what we call now the United States, saying to England, we are not going to abide by your tyranny anymore. You do not have a right to tell us what to do. And because we feel that way, because we are going to break away from your authority, we should at least give you and explain to you why. And this explanation of why to them was self-evident. That, boy, once everybody heard the explanation, you can't blame people for wanting their independence. And clearly, the actions of England were intolerable and should not be recognized or legitimized in any way. So in the second paragraph, they then say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, obviously men, are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, again, denying their just powers from the consent of the governed. And that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. I mean, this is a revolutionary document. And then what they go on to do is provide a litany of circumstances, which they say clearly justifies these actions. So they say later on in the document, to prove this, let facts be submitted to the candid world. And they start to talk about the abuses of England and the king. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation. And then they go on and on, a litany of complaints and problems. So, the participants in Seneca Falls decide that it's a great idea in forming their own declaration of sentiments to parallel the Declaration of Independence, which men revered so much. So here's some of the things they say. And by the way, some of this is in the Lundgren and Taub readings. It says, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of earth a position different from that which they have heretofore occupied, but one to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, which is a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires, that they should declare the causes that impel them to such a course. And then they go on, we hold all these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women, they insert, are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of those who suffer from it to refuse allegiance to it and to insist upon the institution of a new government. So, what these participants are saying is that the Declaration of Independence, that the United States Constitution oppresses women. And because it does that, and it doesn't respect their inalienable rights under God, we have a right to disobey it. We have a right to refuse allegiance to it. And we have a right to insist upon the institution of a new government. Radical stuff. So I would assume these women, when we used to pledge allegiance, probably didn't put their hands over their heart. Then they continue. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and the usurpation on the part of man towards women, having a direct object, the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. And then remember how the Declaration of Independence then lists facts. And they said, to prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. Again, the sarcasm. And to paraphrase some of the things that they list, women have no voting rights. Women must submit to laws which they had no voice over. Women have no political representation. Women become civilly dead upon marriage. Women have no right of property. Women, if married, their husbands become their master. Women can't teach theology, medicine, or law. Women can't go to college. Women are subjected to a different moral code. Women have few employment rights. So, they go across the nation, publicizing this declaration of sentiments, and we embark upon the Civil War as a nation. And women's groups, women's rights advocates and activists, saw the Civil War and the Civil War amendments as an opportunity for great reform. Because after all, if we were going to recognize the rights of former slaves, wasn't this then, in the same vein, the opportunity to recognize the rights of women? Isn't there a parallel here? Aren't they both being deprived of the same kinds of things through no fault of their own? So women, prior to the Civil War, focused on three issues: their right to property in their own names, their right to work in whatever chosen profession they want, and their right to participate politically, the right to suffrage and the vote, the right to hold public office. And after the Civil War, in the late 1860s and early 1870s, as we were debating the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, they hoped that these amendments would not address just race, not just slavery, but also the issue of gender inequality. But to their great disappointment, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, but they did not address gender inequality. And it's not part of the original interpretation of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. In fact, our founding fathers, according to a lot of the transcripts from that era, demonstrated that the members of our Congress deliberately excluded women from the language of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So this led to another uproar among women's groups, fighting for suffrage, fighting for rights. And it led to a movement which called for what was referred to as the Married Women's Property Act. And what these protest groups were looking for here was they wanted to abolish the common law rules of coverture. And this led several states during the 19th century to consider these issues and to adopt legislation that they referred to as the Married Women's Property Act. And as we said, if you think about the legal status prior to this act, marriage ensured a woman's civil death. Woman couldn't sue or be sued. Couldn't execute a will. Couldn't enter into a contract. Her personal property became the husband's property at the moment of marriage. So a husband would own all of her personal property, which at that time they referred to as chattels, whether it was her jewelry, her furniture, any goods. And he could sell it or give it away at his own desire. And if a woman did work, any wage that she made belonged to the husband, not the wife. And the husband had the sole right to appoint the guardians of their children. Now, as we said, there was this movement by women to enact the Married Women's Property Act. And we said that some states did take portions of this. But what we have to understand, there was a very limited acceptance of the Married Women's Property Act. Very limited acceptance. So by the end of the Civil War and the Civil War era, 29 states passed some limited provisions, but they really had little to do with providing gender equality in the true sense of that word. So, for example, Mississippi, back in 1839, passed their own version of the Married Women's Property Act. But what it referred to mainly was a wife's property rights in slaves. So it was tied to the slavery issue. And all it did was it would not allow slaves to be attached by creditors, even the creditors of a wife. So it gave the wife some rights of property ownership only because they wanted to protect slavery. Irony of ironies. And even in this context, the husband still retained the right to manage and control slaves and collect any profits derived from them. So it wasn't really protecting women, but family property, and in this case, specifically the property of a slave. Maryland passed a similar law, and it went a little further. It would try and safeguard some of the wife's original economic assets from the husband's creditors. And again, generally that was seen as slaves that they brought into the marriage, kind of like Thomas Jefferson and his wife in Virginia. And in 1844, Michigan said any personal or real property of women before or after marriage can remain her separate property. Now, Ohio, Indiana, and Iowa passed more limited legislation. And what it basically held was that a wife's real estate could not be seized for a husband's debts. And in the 1860s, Cody Stanton got the New York State to pass the Married Women's Earnings Act, which for the first time gave women the right to keep their own wages. And this was hailed as revolutionary. So when you look at this whole idea of gender equality, or gender discrimination, to put it negatively, what you can see is that through the 1860s and 70s and 80s and 90s and onward, that the legal status of women was not guaranteed by any national doctrine, national statute. Not the Declaration of Independence, not the United States Constitution, not the laws of the United States Congress. So the legal status of women was no more than an aggregation of how different states viewed their rights. All right, now the last thing we're going to look at, and I'm just going to introduce this to you and then we'll stop for today, is we're going to talk about a legal analysis of gender discrimination. So we're going to talk about these 4 areas. Legal discrimination. So make sure you understand Bradwell versus Illinois, Minor versus Hepperset, 1873, 1875. Then we'll talk about qualified legal discrimination, Miller versus Oregon, Hoyt versus Florida. Then we'll talk about legal equality, where you could not any longer legally discriminate based upon gender. And within that context, the ability of women to achieve equality of opportunity. But then, pretty much as we said with race discrimination, women said that wasn't enough. You don't make up for years of discrimination by saying, all of a sudden say, oh, you're equal now. So the 4th area we'll look at is gender and affirmative action. And the desire, which we are still fighting for today, to achieve equality of outcome. The Me Too movement, that's what it's about. The glass ceiling movement, that's what it's about. So please read for our next lecture the rest of the readings in the gender section, and we will talk about a legal analysis and specifically analyze cases for each of these areas. Have a great day, everybody.